Hello, and thank you for joining us for this NHLBI Small Biz Hangout. Today, we'll be discussing the types of initial interactions that a biomedical developer might have with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I am Chris Asiela, a regulatory specialist at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute of the National Institutes of Health, and joining me for today's discussion are Audrey Swearingen and Juhi Shah. Audrey is a Senior Global Regulatory Consultant with the Emergo Group, a global medical device consulting group in Austin, Texas. She has over 19 years experience in regulatory affairs and has been certified in regulatory affairs by the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society since 1977. Before joining the Emergo Group, Audrey held positions with major orthopedic, spine, ophthalmic, and cardiovascular device manufacturers. She also has experience with human and animal tissue products, as well as multiple regulatory issues such as labeling and promotion, quality system compliance, risk assessment, and post-market activities. Audrey has represented her employers and clients during discussions and negotiations with the FDA, including before, during, and after regulatory submissions. Juhi is a health scientist with the Division of Clinical Studies in the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. She has 15 years of experience as a regulatory professional. She began her regulatory career at FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, where she worked as a pharmacology toxicology reviewer and contributed to the drafting of the FDA immunotoxicology guidance document. She continued her career as a regulatory affairs officer at the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, where she developed and implemented regulatory strategies to support academic and commercial clinical investigations in diverse disease indications such as asthma, allergy, influenza, and type 1 diabetes mellitus. At NIAID, she was the regulatory expert for the development and evaluation of radiation nuclear medical countermeasures and animal rule-related projects, one of which was the subject of an FDA advisory committee meeting where Juhi led the Institute's presentation. Today's presentation will begin with Juhi describing the pre-IND process, which is common to both the Center for Drug Evaluation and the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. She'll talk to us about key points to consider when requesting a meeting and developing an information packet. After her presentation, Audrey will talk about how to reach out to the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, and will describe some recent changes in the CDRH pre-submission process. I will then present some information about the FDA level offices that you might want input from during your early product development work. And we will conclude our time today with several case studies using sort of real use situations to describe how you might use these different types of interactions. Throughout the presentations today, please feel free to post questions to our Google Hangout page or tweet them to the NHLBI SBIR account using the hashtag SBIRchat. And now I would like to hand the presentation over to Dr. Shah. Welcome, Juhi, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction, Christy. What I'm going to do this afternoon is kind of give you a how, what, why, and when pre-IND meetings, which are normally the first interaction that you would have, the first formal interaction you would have with the FDA. Okay, so I will start with a disclaimer. The views expressed in this presentation are my personal views and do not represent the views of my employer, BARDA, or of the United States government. So what is a pre-IND meeting? It's about an hour-long consultation with the Food and Drug Administration. It's basically meant for a product that they would normally see under an investigational drug application. You might want to have a pre-IND meeting to reach agreement with the FDA on specific issues or to get their input on something such as the design of a protocol. So what is the basis of a pre-IND meeting? Pre-IND meetings are codified in the Code of Federal Regulations as early consultation meetings and apply only to drugs or biologics that would require an investigational drug application. The guidance that I have listed here in the second bullet is the one that tells you whether or not your study can be conducted without an IND. The FDA also has a procedural guidance out that is titled Formal Meetings between FDA and sponsors or applicants. That's the URL for the guidance document. And the guidance talks about how you would interact formally with the FDA. They have different types of meetings listed, A, B, and C. Pre-IND meetings are type B meetings. So why would you have a pre-IND meeting? There are a number of reasons, a long laundry list as I have here, but some of the key reasons would be because you have a new molecular entity, that is not, there's no predicate for it. You might have a unique indication. You might have an orphan, a drug to treat an orphan disease or an orphan drug product. Maybe you have some non-clinical data that are of concern. For example, you have a positive in your genotoxicity studies, and you still think that your candidate is viable, and you want to know if there are additional studies that you can do to decrease FDA's level of potential concern, or maybe you change the timing of your studies. If you were going to develop a drug for pediatric indications, you might want to discuss that early on. Maybe you're new to either to the drug development scene or to the disease indication that you're now working on, and you want to build a relationship with your FDA review division, understand their thinking about this particular indication, or maybe you just want input on your clinical study protocol ahead of time. But regardless of what your reasons are, you must have specific scientific or regulatory goals. You're usually allowed one pre-IND meeting, and it's best if you time it right and maximize the benefit to you and to the review division. So now to the how. And what I want to do is go use the pre-IND meeting timeline, which I have created from that guidance that I referenced earlier, the one titled Formal Interactions between FDA and Sponsors, and kind of link the how piece to this timeline. So if we assume that the date of your pre-IND meeting is day 0 and work backwards from there, on day -60, you would request your pre-IND meeting. Within 15 to 30 days, FDA would write back to you, send you a letter or some kind of communication that says meeting granted. It might be an email, it might be a fax, it might be a hard copy letter. Then about 4 weeks before your actual meeting, you would have to submit a briefing document to the FDA. A day to 5 days before your meeting, FDA provides you draft responses to the questions that you sent them. And that gives you a little time to discuss so you can focus your discussion at the actual meeting. And after you have the meeting, FDA will provide you official meeting minutes 30 days afterwards. Okay, so now to actually go into more details, how to request a pre-IND meeting. So on day 60, you request your pre-IND meeting in writing. You address your letter or your meeting request to the Chief of Project Management Staff of the Review Division. Now, how do you determine the Review Division? If you're developing a small molecule or something that is under the oversight of the Center for Drugs, your Review Division is based on disease indication. So for example, if you're developing a drug for a congestive heart failure, you would be under the oversight of the cardiorenal group. If you're developing a drug for, say, asthma, it would go to the Division for Pulmonary, Allergy, and Rheumatology Products. On the other hand, the Center for Biologics, your review division is determined based on product type. So is your product a blood product, a vaccine, or a cell or gene therapy? And you know, the last bullet gives you the URL for the contact list for the Center for Drugs, and you can use that to determine who to write to. It wouldn't hurt to call who you consider your contact ahead of time and confirm that they are the right division to send the meeting request to. Now, what goes into the pre-IND meeting request? There are a number of things that need to go in there, but I'm going to just pick the important ones. You must have a little bit of information about your product and the proposed indication. This helps to ensure that you're meeting with the right group of people at the FDA. You've got to let the FDA know that it's you're requesting a pre-IND meeting, so they know what timelines they have to work with. Very important are your list of draft questions, preferably grouped by discipline, and the list of individuals, their titles and affiliations, who you plan to bring to the meeting. And these are the two things that will determine the final list of FDA attendees. You also want to let FDA know, suggested dates and times for those meetings. So FDA does try very hard to meet those, but they may or may not be able to. And the last thing you want to let them know is whether you want to have an in-person or face-to-face meeting or a teleconference. There are also some groups that might be willing to video conference with you, but the first two are usually the preferred interaction. Now, if you remember, after you send in your meeting request, you'll get a letter back from FDA, a meeting granted letter with the date, the time, a tentative list of attendees, as well as other administrative information. And one of the things that the letter will say is that you have to submit your briefing package 4 weeks prior to the meeting. Now, what goes in your briefing document? So you'll have, of course, a cover letter, administrative information, product name, again, more details about your product, the proposed indication, your final list of attendees. This is important because the FDA project manager will have told the guards at the front gate who to expect. And if you bring in people they're not expecting, it might take a little longer to get in. You also want to give them kind of a big picture, a 30,000-foot view of what, where you're planning to go with this compound. Tell them, what the purpose of the meeting is. It can be something very simple, like reach agreement with FDA on the design of the protocol, or get FDA's input on the list, on the questions that we're asking. Very critical. This is your final chance to tweak the questions you initially sent them. So these are your final questions now. And make sure you have enough information to support your question so that FDA can give you informed answers. Now, how do you prepare for the meeting? As I said earlier, FDA will send you draft responses to questions 1 to 5 days before the meeting. Usually it's usually the day before, unless your meeting is on a Monday or a Tuesday. You might get them on the Friday before or the Thursday before. Once you get these, the team, that's minimally the people who will attend the meeting, but it's okay to have additional people there, should meet to review and discuss these responses. The whole point of this is to make sure that you understand what FDA's draft responses mean, and you may be able to eliminate discussing some of the questions further. So maybe you asked FDA 15 questions, but now looking at the draft responses, 9 of the questions you are very clear on, and so when you actually meet with them, you can focus on the remaining 6. It would be ideal to have a meeting leader. This is usually done by the regulatory meeting. Practice does help. It makes perfect. It smooths all the little rough edges out. And then when you go to, if you're going for an in-person meeting to the FDA, please be punctual. Allow about 30 minutes for you to park, to go in through security. FDA will, once you have your meeting with them, FDA will send you official meeting minutes. It would be a good idea to submit your copy of the meeting minutes to FDA. And after you've had the meeting, when you're writing your investigational new drug application, I would strongly suggest you take FDA's advice into consideration. If you are not going to accept a recommendation that FDA made, it would be a good idea to justify why not. This makes clear to the FDA that you heard and read what they told you, that you have not inadvertently left out something, and it really makes you look good. It builds credibility. So my final few tips to you: FDA usually grants one formal pre-IND meeting. So time your meeting right. Ask all the questions you need to ask. Don't waste the opportunity. Also remember, this is not an arena for scientific discussion. You're really going there to meet with a regulating agency, and you are the regulated entity. You really want answers to questions. So phrase your questions as not as discussions, but as something you can get a clear yes or no answer to. Make your briefing document as complete as possible. Usually you cannot add new information because that will delay your pre-IND meeting. And unless it's earth-shattering information and it's worth your time to delay the meeting and include this information, it's probably not a great idea. And ensure that you have enough information in the briefing document that FDA can answer your questions. You don't want to go there and hear, well, we couldn't answer this question, or there's not sufficient information, or we're not clear about your questions. I wanted to end with a few resources. The first bullet is a guidance by FDA about whether or not you need an IND for your study. The second is the URL that connects you to whom to contact for pre-IND meetings. And the final resource I added, this is a guidance for a target product profile. If you're new to the drug development scene, this is the target product profile, or the TPP, is eventually what turns into your package insert. And it's a good idea. It's a good way to focus your thoughts and focus your writing. And hopefully you will have a wonderful meeting. Thank you very much, and I will take any questions.
So I believe we have at least one question at the moment. The question that we have right now is actually not specific to you, Julie, but rather whether or not the presentations will be accessible after today's live delivery. And the answer is that yes, on the NHLBI website for the Office of Translational Alliances and Coordination, we will have a link to both the archived YouTube video of this presentation as well as to the presentations that Julie, Audrey, and I will be delivering throughout the talk today. And that appears to be the only question that we have at the moment. I'm sure we'll get more questions as we proceed through our Hangout today. And so what I'd like to do now is hand the presentation over to Ms. Audrey Swearingen of the Emergo Group. Audrey?
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be part of this hangout today. As you can see, my portion of this presentation is to speak specifically about early communications with the FDA regarding medical devices. So these would be communications with the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. I'm specifically going to go over when to contact the FDA, how to know who to contact at the FDA, and how to actually contact them, as well as discuss various guidances on types of FDA communications, and then end with general tips. So when should you contact the FDA? There is no one specific time, but it's basically whenever you have a question that you cannot find the answer to by looking on the FDA website or comparing your device to existing devices on the market. It's when you have a novel or combination product, very early in development. You may need to contact the FDA if you have questions regarding what classification of device it is, sometimes even whether it's a medical device or a biological or possibly a drug, depending on its intended use, its materials, and so forth. You definitely want to contact the FDA if you're doing animal studies, in particular if it's a novel device in support of a clinical study. If you're unsure about what standards apply to your device or what tests that you have to do for your device to show safety and effectiveness or substantial equivalence if it's a Class 2 510K device, then you contact the FDA with those questions. And then most definitely, before you plan to conduct a clinical study, before you submit an IDE to the FDA to conduct that clinical study, you would want to contact them for their guidance and advice. So let's look at who you should contact at the FDA when you have questions. So we'll look at some various sources for FDA contacts. One of these is the Division of Industry and Consumer Education. This was formerly known as DSMICA, D-S-M-I-C-A. It's since reorganized and revamped into the Division of Industry and Consumer Education. And it now has two branches, the pre-market program branch and the post-market and consumer branch, to better serve both industry and consumers. This is a good point of first contact to answer any general questions you have or to find out what branch, what division, or a contact person that can best answer your question. They are geared to provide technical and regulatory and quality assistance to the medical device industry. And they are made up of former FDA investigators, Office of Device Evaluation reviewers, and other specialists in specific areas. And this also provides their website, email, phone number, information, so that you can know how to contact them. Now, DICE, as I mentioned, provides a variety of services, and you can see here just that vast array of different areas in which they can provide assistance. So if you have questions related to just your establishment registration or the quality system aspects of your of producing, manufacturing your device, or questions about the actual submission or testing, you can first go to DICE and ask these questions, and they can either, one, answer them directly, or two, send you to the appropriate branch or person that can help you. Additional sources for FDA contacts are listed here. Of course, there's the FDA web page itself that has an area on how to contact the FDA. There's a small business brochure, if you will, that also includes information on contacting the FDA. This is actually, there's a whole chapter that deals with small businesses and how to better assist you in having interactions with the FDA. It also provides a list of FDA regional and district offices with contact information, and it includes a lot of links to different websites that can be very helpful to you. And then finally, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health has a management directory which you can access from the medical devices homepage, and there's a box over on the left-hand side that says resources for you that has a lot of information. And this is where you would click to get to the information on the various centers or the various branches within CDRH, and that is broken up into specialties and can provide you a list of the specific people that you could contact for more information. And then lastly, guidance documents themselves has information on who to contact. If you open up a guidance document that is applicable to your device, and I just provided one here as an example, if you have an intravascular stent and there's this guidance document specific to those types of devices, and it discusses the non-clinical engineering tests. So within that guidance document, as in every guidance document, there is a preface on the first page, and within that preface, it has this statement that says, for questions regarding the use or interpretation of this guidance document, there's an FDA contact name. You can contact them at their phone number or by their email, and it gives that as well. So that is one method of obtaining more information or clarification if you have questions regarding the information in a guidance document and how it pertains to your particular device. Oh. So we've already really covered the when to communicate with the FDA. It's whenever you have a reason or a question that you need to bring to their attention in order to get assistance. And for general questions, this is whenever they arise and you have not been able to find the answers on your own. But for specific assistance on submissions and device types and requirements for those types, FDA has issued guidance documents on how to best get FDA input regarding those types of issues. So we'll take a quick look at a couple of those guidance documents. One of these is the guidance on the procedures for Section 513G, which covers requests for information under the FD&C Act. So commonly this is called just a 513G submission, and it is intended to allow a mechanism to obtain FDA feedback on questions about the classification and general regulatory requirements for a device. So if you have not been able to confidently determine the product code or the classification of your device on your own, then you can submit a request for information or a 513G submission to the FDA and get their input on that. The second guidance document that we're going to look at more closely is the one that is for requesting feedback on device submissions, the pre-submission program, and other meetings with the FDA. This is a fairly new guidance document. It looks at the pre-submission program, which and goes through some changes from what industry and FDA previously used. Used to be just called the Pre-IDE process, but it expanded way beyond just IDE issues, so now they've changed it to the pre-submission program. So we'll take a little bit closer look at that in the next few slides. So first of all, we just want to take a closer look at the 513G request itself. So in 513G of the FD&C Act, it says this is a request for information respecting the class in which a device has been classified, or the requirements applicable to a device under the Act. So in this case, the FDA can provide the following types of information to you: assessment of the generic type of the device and the particular class of the device, whether it's class 1, 2, or 3, the type of pre-market submission that is required, if any. Sometimes it will determine that it's class 1 exempt, whether a guidance document is available for that device type or special controls are applicable, and additional FDA requirements for the device type. The FDA does not review data on the device, so they will not be looking at test information or other data that you have submitted to them for review. They will look at data only from the standpoint of determining whether it assists in classification of the device. And it's also important to note that when the FDA provides their feedback on the classification, it is done via a letter, and they're supposed to respond to you within 60 days of receiving your 513G request. And they will state that it is not a formal classification decision. It is based on information that you have provided to them and is applicable at the time of that they are making that determination. But basically, a decision on the classification can be obtained only via the pre-market submission process. So they're not locking themselves in to their determination. But by and large, they do stick to that. Unless you've changed the design of your device from the time that they've responded to your 513G request to the time that you actually submit the 510K or IDE or whatever, then generally their determination can be expected to hold. And now looking at the pre-sub meetings themselves, this is a mechanism, as I mentioned earlier, of obtaining FDA feedback prior to a submission. So this submission could be a 510K submission, an IDE or PMA, as well as other types of submissions. And the guidance document that I mentioned earlier is very comprehensive. It goes through the whole array of the types of different meetings that you can have with the FDA, and when those are appropriate to request such a meeting. So this is, as I mentioned, it's vital to have a pre-sub meeting with the FDA prior to conducting clinical studies for sure, usually before you conduct animal studies, and then possibly too before you conduct bench studies or analytical studies to support your marketing application, just to get the FDA feedback so that you're not spending a lot of time and money conducting studies that you may end up finding later are not appropriate or not adequate. So if your device involves a novel technology or is a first of a kind as far as its indications for use, then you most definitely want to engage the FDA in a pre-submission meeting to get their feedback. If the regulatory strategy is not well established and you're not sure of the requirements that it's going to take to get your device on the market, again, you would want to initiate the conversation with the FDA via pre-sub meeting. If you have an IVD, in vitro diagnostic device that's utilizing a new analyte or has a new reference method, unclear predicate, it's advisable to have a pre-sub meeting with the FDA. And just if you need guidance on specific issues or study protocols, if you specifically have a clinical protocol that you want the FDA's feedback on, or if you have clinical data already that is from a U.S. and a study that's outside the U.S., and how that data may be applicable to your FDA submission, then the FDA can give you that feedback in a pre-sub meeting. So there are also in the guidance specific instances of what a pre-submission is not intended to be. It is not intended to be a mechanism of requesting general information about device requirements. That, as I've already mentioned, is best done informally by contacting DICE or by contacting somebody at the FDA that you've possibly already been in communication with, or initiating that conversation with the appropriate branch or division. It's also not appropriate to simply use as a mechanism to share or educate the FDA about a new device. There is a meeting for that, and it actually is covered in that guidance document as well, and it's called an informational meeting. It's basically simply to let the FDA know in advance what type of device you're working on, if it's a brand new technology, to inform them so that they are aware of what to look for, to let them know that you will be having future meetings with them, and to establish that relationship with the FDA very early on in the process. A pre-submission meeting is also not to get clarification on guidance documents. That can be done informally in less, less formal communication types. And similarly, if you have a question that can be easily answered by a reviewer or staff, please just call them up, as we have already discussed. And a pre-submit meeting, by definition, of course, is pre-submission. So after you've already submitted a marketing submission, it's not appropriate to then request a meeting with the FDA to discuss the requirements. If you have a marketing submission and the FDA has asked for substantial additional information, then there are means of communicating with the FDA and having that dialogue regarding those requirements. It's not a pre-sub meeting. However, if those additional requests for information from the FDA are substantial enough that you are not be able to meet them within the timeline that the FDA expects, then you can withdraw that marketing submission and more or less start fresh, and then request a pre-sub meeting before you initiate the next marketing submission. And as we already mentioned, it's not intended to obtain classification decisions. That is via the 513G request. And it's not intended to get a center assignment for your product. So if you're not sure if it's going to be regulated as a device or a drug, if it's a combination product, you submit a request for designation to the Office of Combination Products, and they will assign, based on the intended use and primary mode of action, what center within the FDA will have jurisdiction over that device. As Dr. Shaw mentioned, for pre-IND submissions, there are specific contents for a pre-submission for devices, and it's very similar to that of an IND. The pre-sub is also sometimes called the Q-sub. The FDA, when they receive a pre-sub packet and pre-sub meeting request, they assign it a Q number, and then a 6-digit number after that, after the Q. And the contents of that pre-sub submission should, of course, include a cover letter stating why you are submitting it and the administrative information on your company and device. It has to have a thorough device description, preferably with images of your device that you have to that date, of course. If you're still in the design and development phase, that's going to be limited. But you have to describe the principle of action, the performance characteristics, the design attributes of your device, what it's made of or going to be made of, a brief summary of manufacturing information, how it's used, what accessories are going to be designed for it, etc. And of course, the intended use must be fully described, including the target population, and sometimes contraindications for use as well. If you've had previous discussions with the FDA or has submitted anything to them prior to the pre-sub meeting, then you need to bring that up to their attention. Outline the device development process. What have you already done in the development process? What have you already tested the device for? And also, what is your planned testing protocol look like? What additional tests are you planning to do? And generally, a pre-sub is focused on those types of issues, on your planned testing strategy going forward. So you have to have specific questions to the FDA. As Dr. Shaw mentioned, you want to ask these specifically. You don't want to have open-ended questions to them. Appendix 1 of the pre-sub guidance document offers types of questions that are appropriate to ask the FDA. And actually, Appendix 1 is very valuable because it goes through each type of pre-submission request that you can submit and provides specific details that are appropriate for each type of pre-sub. Also, you have to request the method of feedback that you are wanting to get the FDA input, whether it's just via email or whether you're fine with doing a teleconference with them, or if you want a face-to-face meeting. And face-to-face meetings are valuable from the standpoint of if you haven't met with them before, to establish that relationship, to get face-to-face with them, and it's always easier to communicate that way. And if you're planning to have a teleconference or requesting a face-to-face meeting, then you need to also provide them a list of the planned attendees from your side, so that they can plan appropriately and have the correct attendees from their side as well. And again, if you're requesting an actual meeting, you need to provide an agenda, a proposed agenda for that meeting. And it needs to be focused on the actual design of your device. You don't want to spend a lot of information on, or a lot of time telling them about your company and the research of your device. You really want to focus on the development phase of your device and the questions that you have for the FDA. So you have to cover that information adequately, and then it's very advisable to leave at least 10 minutes at the end of the meeting time to summarize the action items that have been discussed, to confirm and clarify any takeaways, and allow adequate discussion. And get that feedback from the FDA before you leave. And it's important to note that the FDA very rarely will allow a meeting that goes beyond 1 hour. So you have to plan appropriately, and again, as Dr. Shaw mentioned, for IND meetings, it's vital that you practice before you go to the FDA. You practice having the meeting. You go through your presentations, you anticipate questions that they might ask, so that you can get the most out of that time with them. And then I just want to leave with some final words of advice that apply to any type of communication that you have with the FDA. Please be respectful of their time. You are trying to build a favorable relationship with them and build a good reputation. So you don't want to become a pest. You don't want to call them up every other day with a different question. So you want to do your homework before contacting the FDA. The FDA has a database or series of databases, and I put the link here. And I believe that in the previous NHLBI Hangout that was conducted some months ago, that covered navigating the FDA website, and these FDA databases were looked at then. But it has databases for product classification, for 510Ks, for PMA approval letters, for adverse events that have been reported, and standards. And so I just encourage you to go to those databases and look through them before you go directly to the FDA with a question, because quite often you can find the answer in guidance documents or these databases. When you do communicate with them, do provide them with adequate information. Okay, they're coming at it new, right? They don't know anything. So you have to provide them with adequate information in order for them to be able to answer your question appropriately. And do be clear and concise about what you are wanting from them in return. And don't expect them to answer everything to your satisfaction, because they are not your design and development department, and they're not your personal regulatory department. They will do what they can, but they also expect you as the technical experts for your device to be able to determine a lot of what needs to be done in order to show that your device is safe and effective for its intended use. So with that, That's it, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Audrey. That was a wonderful presentation. So we actually do have a few questions. And the first question is, if you are intending for your first meeting with the FDA to be an early feasibility or first in human meeting as requested, in accordance with the most recent guidance document that came out, are there any differences in how you would approach that meeting versus a normal pre-submission meeting?
That's a good question. Generally, I would say no. Of course, your early feasibility clinical study, your questions need to be specific to that, determining that safety in humans, first and foremost. And you need to also focus on providing them the information on your non-clinical studies that support allowing you to go into humans in that early feasibility study. So you just need to make sure you provide them that data. But the mechanism of requesting that feedback and meeting with the FDA is the same.
Thank you very much. And then a second question has come in. Would you recommend that a filling company set up a pre-IND or pre-IDE meeting with the FDA using the assistance of a consulting company as opposed to attempting to lead this meeting on their own? And this question is for either Julie or Audrey, whomsoever wishes to respond.
Well, so I have a question back, really. You said that a filling company?
So the way that I would read that question is, if it were a company that were a manufacturing CMO perhaps that is going to be doing a fill and finish on a medical product, a biomedical product. Okay, well, so I guess I'll respond to the question then. The question is, for a filling company, should they choose to use a regulatory consultant or choose to independently respond or request a meeting with FDA? And quite honestly, that is going to be dependent upon the resources that are available to you. If you have consultants or people on your board of advisors who have been in these types of meetings before and who can really guide you in their execution, then it's perfectly fine for a company. It doesn't need to be a big company. Small companies go to FDA regularly, and so you can certainly lead that on your own. However, if you feel that you don't have the expertise in-house to address putting together a meeting packet, then it is always, of course, appropriate to seek out external consultants to assist you. And we also have another question, that one of our audience members has heard that there is something called a pre-IND meeting, and they're curious about the requirements of this compared to a regular pre-IND meeting. And I would like to respond to this one. So the pre-IND meeting is an informal communication that the Office of Cellular Tissue and Gene Therapies has created to help investigators in that field understand more fully the requirements for a pre-IND meeting and to inform their product development at the earliest stages. And so the appropriate way to approach that interaction is to reach out to the regulatory project manager within OCTGT and request their briefing document. They have a small, it's not really a formal guidance document, but it explains what that office expects to receive from a sponsor or an investigator in order to have an informed discussion that can help the agency provide feedback to those investigators on their pre-development work. And so if you are interested in engaging in that type of meeting, it is, as far as I understand, only through that one office within the Center for Biologics, and you would reach out directly to that office to get the information on how to conduct that meeting. Do either Julie or Audrey have additional input that they'd like to offer at this point on that topic?
So sometimes if you are developing something via the animal rules, for example, or something for a very unusual indication, FDA will allow you, again, a less formal or a more informal meeting. They may expect you to follow the process for a pre-IND meeting. The only reason they would call it a pre-IND meeting is because they're going to let you have, they're not going to hold you to the one meeting restriction that they usually hold companies to, because you're coming in early for something that's an unusual situation. That would be one other possibility. And you would go about it the same way that you would a pre-IND meeting, but it might be easier to talk to the chief of project management at the review division and kind of tell them why you're asking for this additional early input.
Excellent. Thank you for adding that in, Julie. That's great advice to our companies. So we are running a little bit low on time, but hopefully you can hang around for a few more minutes, because there are some additional early interactions that I'd like to review briefly. And so let's get this screen share going. As I mentioned, and as we looked at during the March Hangout on navigating the FDA website, each of the biomedical centers does have a small business outreach office. And so in terms of making your very first contact with the agency, where you may not understand which office or division or branch would be reviewing your technology, you can always reach out in the Center for Devices Evaluation and Research. That is the Small Business and Industry Assistance Office. And in CBER, it's the Office of Communication, Outreach, and Development. And as Audrey mentioned earlier, within CDRH, that is the Division of Industry and Consumer Education. The email addresses and phone numbers for these offices are listed on this slide. In addition to those outreach offices at the FDA level, there are additional offices that you may want to reach out to. One is the Office of Combination Products, and there are some guidance documents that this office has put out recently, as combination products are a growing segment of the biomedical development technology field these days. And so they have a guidance document released in 2006 on early development considerations for innovative combination products. Audrey and Julie, I believe, both mentioned the request for designation. So you would submit that to the Office of Combination Products, and they have a guidance document that will describe to you what the content of that should be. And then just a few years ago, they clarified how they classify products as either drugs or devices, and some additional product classification issues in this somewhat sticky arena. So you can, again, read those guidance documents and or reach out to the office itself. Another very emergent field in biomedical technology development these days are orphan product or orphan designated products. And these are, the regulation of these is mediated through but not actually reviewed in the Office of Orphan Product Development. So the Office of Orphan Product Development will help you understand whether or not your indication fits the orphan definition, and will help you identify the appropriate review division, but the review itself will happen in CBER, CDER, or CDRH as is applicable for your technology. If you have questions about whether or not your product will meet an orphan drug designation, you can reach out for non-oncology products to Jeff Fritsch, for oncology products or for devices or rare pediatric disease designations to James Bona. For the Orphan Grant Program, you can reach out to Mary Limon. And for the Pediatric Device Consortia grants, you can reach out to Linda Ulrich. And this is the phone number for the Office of Orphan Product Development. Because so many new companies are reaching out to this office, the office has recently released a guidance document, Meetings with the Office of Orphan Product Development. This guidance was distributed on April 9th of this year and is open for comment all the way through July 8th. So if you haven't read it yet and it pertains to your product development, you may want to go ahead, read it, and if you have comments, submit them to the docket before the 8th of July. The guidance document describes the types of informal meetings that one can have with OOPD, and I'm not going to read them because they are on the slide. And and then also the types of formal meetings that you can have. So you can be talking about very general information or be looking for very specific questions about your request for orphan designation or things of that nature. And these meetings fall very much into the same types of categories as Julie and Audrey have already described. So with that in mind, we have actually reached the end of the time that we have scheduled for our Hangout, and so I appreciate people hanging around. If you have the time to remain online for another 10 minutes, we have a few brief case studies that we would like to review, and so I'm going to just jump right on into that. And our first case study is that Heart Company is developing a mitral valve replacement device. They have had no contact with FDA, but they are confident of their classification and their path to market. However, they're a little bit unclear about the specific benchtop, physical, and preclinical animal model testing that will be required for their technology. So our question here is, how do they find out what specific testing will be required for their technology? Audrey, are you able to address this?
Yes, Chris, I'm happy to. So in this case, if it is fairly evident of what type of device it is and how it's classified, and the pre-market approval process. So there are 3 different ways that they could go about determining the testing requirements. First and foremost, as I mentioned in my presentation, doing some preliminary due diligence, looking at the guidance documents that pertain to your particular device. In this case, there is a guidance document on heart prostheses. You can, those often outline very specifically the tests that the FDA expects for your device. You can find those. You can also look under the product classification database under the product code, and that will list certain tests that are also expected. And then the standards that are referenced for the device in either the guidance document or the classification database, you can also look at to determine if those apply to your device. Secondly, contact the appropriate branch or division of CDRH with general questions that you have. If you just have some general questions on types of testing, but the best way to do this, and eventually, regardless of how you initially contact the FDA, but eventually you will want to submit a pre-submission to get their input on the on your proposed testing plan, and very specifically what tests that the FDA is going to expect to see in an IDE for a heart valve device specifically, what type of testing they're going to require to support that IDE and clinical study going forward. But this is the same even if it's for a Class 2 510K device. If you can't get all of the information from the guidance documents or standards, then by all means submit that pre-IDE and ask the questions to get more formal feedback from the FDA on what testing is expected.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Audrey. Case study 2. Blood Company has just licensed the intellectual property for an orally available small molecule they believe will be able to treat vaso-occlusive crisis in sickle cell disease. They have developed intravenous products in the past, but this is their first oral dosage form. Who at FDA do they ask about the different regulatory requirements in this new area? Julie, would you be willing to address this question?
Sure. So, the first place that they can ask, it sounds like this is a company that normally does blood products, so they might be more familiar with the Center for Biologics and not the Center for Drugs. So they might want to just contact their small business office, the one you referred to earlier, Christy, and to make sure that they know which division to contact. And then once they know which division to contact, they might want to request a pre-IND. Sometimes when you have a lot of questions, you might want a pre-IND meeting not only to discuss the clinical and preclinical pieces, but also the manufacturing pieces, such as how they're going to test how they're going to do release testing, how they're going to develop a small molecule, and then eventually, talk to them about the drug development path for their new small molecule drug. And and orphan drugs, if sickle cell is an orphan drug product. So the Office of Orphan Drugs too.
Great. Thank you very much, Julie. And so now moving on to case study 3. Lung Company is developing an artificial main bronchus impregnated with growth factors to stimulate cellular infiltration of and long-term integration with native tracheal and lower branch bronchial tissues for the treatment of traumatic lung injury. Who do they reach out to at FDA to understand their regulatory path? So in this case, the company is developing what is likely to be viewed as a combination product because it is both a device and a drug with an impregnated drug. And so they would want to reach out to the Office of Combination Products and perhaps even submit a request for designation supporting their contention that they are either a device or a drug and that they wish to be regulated in such a manner. Once the Office of Combination Products has received their request for designation and adjudicated it and returned to them the decision of which center and review division will be overseeing the regulation of their technology, then they can reach out specifically to that review branch or division and go through the standard pre-submission process, whether it's a Q submission for the Center for Devices or a pre-IND meeting for the Center for Drugs. So that concludes the case study section of our presentation today. And I would like to just close with a reminder that this is an ongoing series, Conquering the Regulatory Basics of the NHLBI Small Biz Hangouts. Our first Hangout, Navigating the FDA website, has been archived and is available on the NHLBI YouTube channel. Today's presentation will be available in about a month, also archived on the NHLBI YouTube channel. And our upcoming events in September, on September 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, we will be presenting an overview of medical device classification and regulation. And on December 16th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll be presenting an overview of drug and biologics regulation. At this point, are there any other questions from the audience? We are not seeing any other questions online at this point. Audrey or Julie, do you have any closing words that you'd like to share with our small business biomedical developers?
No, none for me, Chris.
No? Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention and your time today. I hope that you found this Hangout to be useful, and we appreciate any and all feedback that you would care to provide. Our Twitter handle is at NHLBI_SBIR, and I wish you the most wonderful of days. Thank you very much.